Good morning and welcome to those of you joining us on Zoom. You'll just give us a moment for people to load into the Zoom room. We will get started momentarily. Good morning and welcome to today's event. This is the fourth event we've held on the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the implications of that war across the globe. So far, we have addressed the sanctions directly and the implications of the war on food security and global trade. Today, we're tackling another of the major implications, the shift away from Russian fossil fuels and toward newer and hopefully cleaner sources of energy. Before we get to today's event, a few announcements. Next week, we have an all-star panel assembled to discuss one of the key issues that the WTO hopes to address at their next ministerial, economic empowerment and gender equality in trade. We hope you'll join us for that event next Thursday. We're also pleased to announce a very special event on May 10th, looking into the last 10 years since the US-Colombia Free Trade Agreement went into effect. That event will be our first in-person policy event since March of 2020, be held at the Ronald Reagan Building in Washington, D.C. We hope you can join us for both of those events. Information will be linked in the chat and can be found on our website, www.wita.org. At WITA, we're trying to do our part to give back to the global community that we're all a part of by supporting a joint fundraiser with the World Central Kitchen to feed the hungry in Ukraine. If you'd like to join us in supporting World Central Kitchen, you can find information on that event in the program you received this morning, and we'll share the links here and on our website. If you've watched any of our webinars over the past 2 years, you know we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with on Zoom, even if you can't see them here today. So welcome today to Betsy Monceau with the American Coal Council, Ben Priddy with Chevron, Susanna Choi with Aramco, and Yukiko Morishita with Chubu Electric Power. Welcome Betsy, Ben, Susanna, and Yukiko, and welcome to all of you. If you're joining us on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panel today using the Q&A tab. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can during and toward the end of our session. You should have also received a copy of today's event program by email so we can dispense with lengthy introductions of our guests and move right to our event. To start with, we'd like to welcome two new guests to the WITA stage, both coming to us from Europe. First, our moderator today, Henning Gloystein, who I think is coming to us from Oslo. Did you say Oslo today, Henning?
It's actually Oxford.
Close. Oxford. I misheard you. Oxford. Henning is Director of Energy, Climate, and Resources at the Eurasia Group. Among other things, his work focuses on the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, the topic of our event today. We're so pleased you could join us, Henning. We're also pleased to welcome to the WITA stage Andreas Goldthau with the Institute of Advanced Sustainable Studies and the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy at the University of Erfurt in Germany. Andreas is also an expert in today's topic, the political economy of low carbon transitions. Welcome, Andreas. Also like to welcome back to the WITA stage two good friends of many of ours, Vanessa Ciara, the Vice President of Trade and International Competitiveness at American Clean Power Association. Many of you also probably know Vanessa from her long career in international trade, including with the National Foreign Trade Council and the Emergency Committee for American Trade. Welcome back, Vanessa. And last but not least, my good friend Maureen Hinman, the co-founder and executive chair of Silverado Policy Accelerator, which has really carved out an important profile in DC on national security, cybersecurity, and ecological and economic security. Previously, Maureen served as Director for Environment and Natural Resources at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Welcome, Andreas, Maureen, Vanessa, and Henning.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Ken. So welcome everybody to this session. It's sadly, it's a serious subject matter with some worrying and scary developments on the ground, of course, in Ukraine, but also beyond Ukraine. And we will try and address some of these. One of the most important aspects right now is energy supply. Because of following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's been a lot of sanctions introduced. Initially targeting oligarchs in the financial sector, But of course, the energy sector is what's on everybody's mind. Should the EU follow US sanctions on oil and natural gas to be imposed on Russia? For Europe, the consequences of such action would be pretty vast and pretty significant, because Europe receives a lot of oil, coal, and natural gas from Russia. Coal has already been introduced, but oil is on the radar right now. Natural gas is probably a last resort, which we'll hear from in a little bit. The reason is fairly simple. The European Union, give or take, receives about 40 to 50% of its imports of oil and natural gas from Russia. And depending on where you are, for instance, Germany, that reliance is even higher. And that reliance is skewed to the winter when we need heating gas. And of course, that means should there be a disruption of gas supply to Europe, we would probably or maybe see some rationing of heating. And when people freeze at home in winter, that actually means people suffer. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a hard sell. We will get into some of this detail, though, from Germany. But of course, this has ramifications around the world long term. Does Europe double down on its green transition? But even before then, how can it replace Russian natural gas and oil? Of course, US LNG comes onto the radar here. Qatar has announced it'll try and produce more LNG as well. So that focuses a lot of the shift on who can actually supply this natural gas to Europe to replace Russia. And can we do this with strategic partners? So supply chain diplomacy suddenly becomes a big issue. And then, of course, that means in the United States, what do we do with the green transition there in what is still the world's biggest economy? If suddenly oil and gas companies can make a huge profit by selling to Europe, does that take away the focus of on the energy transition in the United States itself? So, and of course, how in trade deals do you organize long-term supplies between the US and the EU in a case of emergency? We still need to keep in mind that there are commercial and legal realities to keep in mind here, especially given, for instance, that the European Union actually operates a free market. So you can't just do a collective import supply deal with the United States at a fixed price. It doesn't really work like that. Anyway, that's just many things to think about. I will turn it first to our colleague and Andreas Goldthau in Berlin, I believe, and to tell us a little bit, what is the emergency? How will Germany and the EU as a wider bloc try and get itself through the coming winter and 2023, but while trying to wean itself off Russian oil, gas, and coal? Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Henning, and thanks very much, Ken and WITA for having me. It's a great pleasure. It's an honor to speak. Well, I was asked to talk a little bit about precisely the balancing act that Henning just outlined for European countries to, well, address shortage in supply, but at the same time not throwing climate goals out of the window. And let me just maybe make 3 quick points here when it comes to that balancing act. The first is that I think it really, really matters what resource you're looking at. There's a massive difference between coal, oil, and gas. When it comes to coal, I wouldn't say it's a done deal, but in the end, Russian coal is on the way out, I'd say, when it comes to the European energy system. We've just seen an agreement on the 5th sanctions package, as part of which coal will be phased out. It's going to take a couple of months. But in the end, Russian coal is not going to be a factor going forward in the European energy system. What makes things obviously a lot easier than in other places or when it comes to other energy resources is the fact that, just take Poland and Germany together, and you almost have 2/3 of hard coal consumption in Europe. So if they agree, it's a done deal, and that's what happened. With oil, it's a little bit more difficult, but I'd still say it's doable to phase out Russian oil supplies in a reasonable time frame. About 6% of Russian oil go to Europe. That's OECD Europe, so mainly the European Union. Another 20% go to China. And so we're talking about roughly 4.5 million barrels of oil a day that the Russians send west. Now, you can curb that, and there's various ways of doing that. The problem is we have a global oil market, and oil is a fungible commodity. So you could say, look, on the European side, we no longer take off the oil, but at the same time, you've got other importing economies that at the moment are carefully watching what's happening on the oil market. And we have seen the Russians offering the Royal at discounts, up to 20% of what's demanded on global markets. India has, at the moment, for instance, eyed Russian oil supplies for their import portfolio. They're in part shifting their imports to Russian sources. So the question really is, how do you prevent Russia from selling oil somewhere else, even if the Europeans no longer take it off? And here, I guess, the sanctions regime needs to respond, and we need to think very carefully about how to do this. It would probably take things like targeting ships or ports, all the way down to refineries. I mean, there's these things that need to happen in order to deal with the very fundamental fact that we're talking about a global oil market and a fungible commodity. But it's doable. The biggest headache is gas in the end. And Henning alluded to that already, but I think it's important to bear in mind a couple of numbers. That's the metric system. The Europeans import about 150 billion cubic meters of Russian gas. Germany has about a third of that. So that's 50 BCM roughly. And although Europe has a lot of LNG import terminals, most of the physical delivery, particularly for Russian gas, is through pipelines, and that's through Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and Nord Stream 1 mainly. Now you could say, well, why don't they just replace Russian gas with, say, American gas and Qatari gas? Well, two bottlenecks: one, physical capacity. Most of the LNG import terminals run at full capacity, at least in the northern part. There is still capacity in the southwest of Europe, but a lot of the import terminals in Spain and elsewhere don't really help because you don't have the physical interconnection to where the gas is needed. Plus, you have a very, very tight global market situation. I mean, we're not talking about a lot of additional LNG being around. I mean, the global market is what, 500 BCM? The US have 100 of that, Qatar has 100 of that, Australia has 100 of that, which means you got to talk to those guys to find additional molecules. And that's precisely what the Europeans are doing at the moment. A lot of energy ministers are running around across the globe trying to strike deals. Now, in addition to the legalities of that, and that's where the European energy market design comes in and the liberal market setup, I don't want to go into that direction. That's a headache of its own. But on top of that, there simply isn't a lot available. So so even if the US pledges some freedom gas for the Europeans, it essentially comes down to a couple of BCM and not more. The Qataris will not be able to provide more than a couple BCM either. And the Norwegians may pledge 1, 2, 3, or 4 BCM going forward. That will not do away with Russian gas of 100 BCM. And so what it boils down to is essentially adjustment needs to come through demand side responses. And that essentially means economic contraction big time. Full stop, period. And that's precisely why it is so politically charged. And that's why the Germans have been so hesitant. But not only the Germans, also other countries. Just think about Italy for the sake of the argument. The Germans have 50% import from gas. Italy has 40. Other countries in Eastern Europe are up to 100 almost. So it all boils down to Germany in terms of discussions, but I think this is a more general problem. And I think it's important to bear that in mind. So that's in terms of additional, just trying to break things down a little bit when it comes to energy sources. But I think there's a second aspect to it, which I would quickly like to talk about, which is also to add a little bit more granularity on two aspects of that balancing act. The first is timing. The question really is how quickly will and should the Europeans phase out Russian oil, gas, and coal. As I said, coal is not necessarily the big discussion here, but I think still we need to bear in mind that the quicker Russian gas is out, the higher the demand for brown fuels and the deeper the economic impact. And that's a trade-off, and we're aware of this. This is a political decision. It's not an economic decision. But I also think it's important to bear in mind what that means for global markets. I mean, the quicker the Europeans phase out Russian gas, the higher the ripple effect for LNG markets, for the sake of the argument, because the Europeans will end up buying LNG that otherwise would go elsewhere. And where do they buy it from? Well, probably from places that don't have the purchasing power of Europe. So you have essentially an energy justice problem here when it comes to that timing issue. Similar things can be said about coal. we have already seen that European coal futures prices surged really to record highs last month in anticipation of an EU embargo on Russia. And that again has spillovers for Africa, Asia, Latin America, and other places. On top of that, the timing issue has implications on different countries within the EU, and they are affected differently, simply because of them being different when it comes to the energy intensity of their economies. Some economies are very service-oriented and less energy-intensive, and others are more energy-intensive, which means the moment you phase out very quickly a feedstock like gas, and the moment you cannot replace it, it has different economic costs, different parts in Europe. The reason why I'm making that argument is because we're trying to keep together a sanctions front in Europe and beyond. And the sanctions regime is only as strong as the weakest members supporting that regime. So we need to think very carefully about the costs and how they're distributed. And the timing, therefore, not only means we got to think hard about the economic impact, but also how to buffer the impact for different parts of Europe. Another quick element in terms of granularity, and then I come to my conclusion on what all of this means in terms of climate policy. I think another point of granularity really is that I think there is instruments other than just embargoes that we should probably bear in mind here. And at present, I understand why. There's a lot of talk about cutting oil, gas, and coal from Russia, and that's fine, and that's absolutely understandable. And given the fact that Europe, but also other countries, send billions, literally, of dollars to Russia as revenue from oil, gas, and coal exports, that is something that warrants and justifies that discussion. But you could also think about different ways of achieving the same effect. Just think about an import tax or trade levy on Russian energy imports. What that would do is you would reduce demand in Europe because of the higher price, but at the same time, you generate revenues for redistribution, for instance, in Europe. So you would shift the rent from producers to consumers and curb income for Putin and Russia, whilst at the same time, essentially generating some income that you can use to buffer some of the negative effects of doing so. The reason why I'm making that argument, and it's not my argument, it has been put forward by various people, including Daniel Groß from the CEPS in Brussels, and they have done their math on this. But the reason why I'm putting this forward is because it might look a little bit more complicated, but it might be the smarter option than just to say, let's go cold turkey and let's leave it at that. Which gets me to my final point, which is what does all of this mean for climate policy goals and EU decarbonization? And I guess there's two aspects to this. One, I guess that's the short-term aspect, and that's about plugging holes. Plug holes when it comes to feedstock in terms of gas, feedstock in terms of oil, but also consequences for say the steel industry when it comes to coal. But at the same time, I think we have a second element here which is important. And just to give you a few examples, Germany is fostering the green hydrogen economy. They're fostering solar wind deployment at scale. They're fostering fundamental process innovation in industry as a reaction to the Ukraine war. The country is ramping up solar tenders from 5 to 20 gigawatts until 2028. They put another 200 billion extra into climate measures, parts of which go into the energy system. Berlin has just backed zero emission targets for vehicles as of 2035, which is remarkable given their very different track record when it comes to tougher standards in vehicle emissions. And they're not alone. The Netherlands are doubling the planned capacity in offshore wind by 2030. Italy has said they want, and I quote here, several tens of gigawatts of offshore wind power going forward, which is remarkable given the fact that they don't have any at the moment. And there's a tremendous push on the EU level when it comes to all of this. Let me just mention the repower plan and a whole bunch of other things that are being implemented or planned at the moment at the European level to complement the national level measures. And the list goes on. So the irony of all of this is, yes, we're bringing coal back to some extent. We're probably seeing some more of the brown stuff going forward. But at the same time, the Ukraine war has essentially put the European energy transition on steroids. And what I'm expecting actually is this panning out very positively until essentially the end of the decade. I don't really expect a great dip even when it comes to climate policy. So let me just stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andreas. A lot to ponder here, and maybe at the end we can get back to a little bit of discussion on some of those aspects. But I want to move on a little bit to the United States here. Vanessa, I mean, Andreas just mentioned, so if the EU suddenly buys 50 BCM additionally of LNG this year, that would add 10% to global LNG consumption. And of course, American LNG sellers are really keen to get a share of that because it would in fact, it's already driving prices up. If you look at the forward curve of natural gas prices in Europe, they're sky high right through to 2024, which is great if you sell gas, but it's not so great if you have to consume it. But in all this, I mean, where's the US transition as well? Because I assume, sure, there's a lot of folks in the US that want to sell LNG now, strategically important for Europe, make a lot of money out of this. Maybe drives prices up in the US as well, and the Henry Hub price. Where does this leave the American energy transition itself, which, lest we forget, is still the world's biggest economy and has similar issues in general, maybe not the supply problems with Russia, but overall long-term problems are the same. Where do you see this developing?
Well, thanks, Henning, and thanks to WITA for having me. Just to sort of level set a minute, my association represents the largest utility scale developers of wind, solar, and storage in the United States. So we are heavily invested in the climate goals of the Biden administration. Let me just say at the outset, no one would have wished this crisis on any administration. It's horrifying, and obviously, in the short term, we stand behind the Biden administration's desire to assist our allies in Europe. And if this means, increased production of U.S. oil and natural gas in order to meet both U.S. needs and the needs of our allies, I think that's probably a sound geopolitical and moral position. But the big picture that I deal with every day is how are we doing on the energy transition in the United States? And when Ken and I started talking about this panel, Ken said to me, "What do you think? How are they doing?" The Biden administration, we have 2 full years of data to look at, and can we do sort of a level set? And I think. And I'm speaking on my own, and this is my own opinion. I'm not, don't attribute this to all of my members. I have a lot of members, but my own feeling is we're feeling unloved. And I think I would add to that other adjectives: frustrated, exhausted, perplexed. I think coming in, the Biden administration, as one of its 4 pillars, said climate was one of the 4 goals of the administration over its 4 years in office. And we're sort of feeling like, well, okay, that's a great aspirational goal, and we applaud all the rhetoric on climate. But as a practical matter, I think we're perplexed. It's sort of a tortured climate policy in many ways in terms of the way they deal with our industry. And I like Andreas's concept of a policy on steroids. I don't think we're on steroids. I think we're kind of limping along. I think there's some good initiatives that have been made. We applaud the infrastructure bill, for example, but there's a lot more to do. So let me just make a couple comments on that front. The time frames for building out a domestic infrastructure for renewable energy are really long. You don't just say you're going to build a plant to make solar modules and the next week you're cranking out panels. You don't say you're going to lease offshore wind licenses and then have towers put up a year later. This is not the way our industry works. These are really heavily manufactured products, and they involve a lot of technical, and in many cases, unionized skills to put this energy grid, this energy infrastructure into place. So everyone who looks at clean energy needs to understand that we're talking about long timeframes. I always tell people, this is not a month or a year project. This is like 3 to 5 to 10 years. And that's true for the permitting, that's true for the building, that's true for the financing, and that's true for the rate of returns for investors. So we need to be thinking about all this now, even amidst all the other concerns that we have to worry about. And there are sort of 2 trends that we see that I think I'll mention. The first is this desire by industry, which the Biden administration supports, to provide incentives, tax incentives, frankly, to create market incentives for domestic build out of infrastructure and clean energy. And that is why it is a key ask of the entire industry, and I mean the entire industry. Everyone in solar, wind storage, domestic importers, we all agree that the key ask of the administration and the Congress is this tax incentive package that was formerly known as Build Back Better. It's now known as reconciliation. I think people know it as the debate with certain senators about what this bill could look like. It's a key piece of legislation. It's been discussed repeatedly before the holidays. Now it's looking like it might be a spring or summer initiative, but that renewable energy manufacturing piece is critical. That is what drives markets in this country. That is what gets people to put up the financing. That is what gets the utilities to project out for projects. And all of this is done on long time frames. So the sooner that legislation gets passed, the more you'll see, I think, projects in the ground, commitments on licensing, and a more robust sort of landscape for domestic manufacture, which again, we all think is important and we all support. At the moment, we're importing a lot. And that's because we don't make most of the utility grade solar panels that we need, and we don't make a lot of the parts that we need for storage and for wind turbines. So that's my second point. We need the administration to seriously look at its trade policy towards our industry. And the place where we're feeling the most sort of pain right now is at the Commerce Department, where there's a circumvention case that deals with imported solar products. I'm not going to get into the details because it's a trade law sort of rabbit hole that I'm not going to go down, but let's just say that we think the Commerce Department is making some very wrong-headed decisions about pursuing a current case, a circumvention case on solar panels that are made in allied nations in Southeast Asia, places where we consider to be friends and places where we need support in terms of dealing with the challenge that is China. So I think that is a problem for us. And when I say perplexing and frustrating, I really mean largely on the trade policy side. We also have some concerns about 301 tariffs that continue to be levied on imports that we need to build wind towers and to create energy storage, and that's perplexing as well. We would like to see some reform of the 301 tariff policy and certainly an enhanced exclusion policy. So that's a lot, but that's sort of my set of opening remarks on that.
Thank you, Vanessa. Over to you, Maureen. I mean, we've already seen a fair bit of this sort of term that's comes up a lot now, supply chain diplomacy between the US and EU, suddenly, to send LNG as part of building strategic gas reserves in Europe over. I mean, how do you see that developing? It's hard to talk about opportunity in a war like this, and it's a wrong term, but it does create new paths in terms of trade and diplomacy and joint energy relations. What's the view from the US here? I mean, where do you reckon this will lead?
Is this towards me or Vanessa?
I'll hand it over to you, Maureen, first, okay. But I'm sure Vanessa can say something as well. Sorry.
I apologize, Henning. Yeah, so thanks so much. You know, I think that just a couple of sort of principles up front. To your point, it's a pretty, horrible situation, but also in some ways just sort of breathtakingly amazing, the level of sort of cooperation and grit that both our friends in Europe and the US are showing. I know that I've been very surprised by the response and the unified response on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think, in fact, it's been a real vector of success because it was precisely the type of cohesion that Putin did not anticipate. He actually betted on our divisions and betted on the EU and the US falling apart. And it turns out, those alliances still matter. But to Andreas's point, I think that there's a lot of sort of pressure points within that we need to think about continuously shoring up and addressing, and the solutions are going to be sticky and problematic, and we just have to face those head on. I will say what we're seeing right now in the transatlantic relationship is something that I think is really based on our common and shared values, and that has opened up the door for a lot of collaboration and cooperation and pathways to be doing big things in the light of this crisis that even 3 months ago I'm not sure would have been a subject that we could have broached. So just a couple of points on the energy sector. Andreas made the smart point. Europe doesn't just need power; they need heat. And for folks who don't understand how energy works, there's a lot of many of the renewable energy vectors that we all love to talk about, like wind and solar, don't produce any heat. And so that's a very tough thing to get around in the short term. Europe has invested heavily in a new hydrogen economy, but to Vanessa's point, energy not only takes a long time to scale and to implement with permitting and other rules, it also takes a long, those systems are going to be with us for a long time. The energy infrastructure lasts, typically from 30 to up to 80 years, depending on what type of energy you're using. And so we want to be making sound decisions, not just in light of the crisis, but also in light of our long-term goals. And I think that, heartening on the European side is the Europeans have been very resolute in saying, we want a clean economy. And more so, we need a clean economy because a clean economy is also an independent economy. And we don't have to be reliant on Russian fuel if we're producing hydrogen at home. We don't have to be reliant on pipelines if we've got sort of sources of clean energy at home, and we're able to basically own our own grid. And so I think that has been very, very helpful. In the short term, we continue to need fossil fuels, and I think that the rationality that's emerged on both sides has been very, very useful. I think that we need to think about ways to make that short-term consumption minimize the environmental and climate damage of that. As Andreas said, the European march towards a clean economy is on steroids. Vanessa, I would say, yeah, unfortunately, I think our march is on Starbucks. So we need to ramp up our production and our will. And, we have great technology in the US. And we have a lot of means to move forward, but we need to kind of match our partners across the Atlantic. Now, what's to be done in the short term, medium term, and long term? In the short term, I think it's important for us to think about where we're closest with our European allies. One of the easiest and most straightforward things that we could do within the next couple of weeks, if not months, is just agree in the short term in base of the emergency, is eliminate tariffs on environmental technologies between the EU, the US, and maybe some other allies. It's such a gimme. I don't know why we continue to tax each other when we're not the problem in international markets. We both have very high standard economies. We keep really clean, permitting processes, and elsewhere, we're not each other's problem on the consumption side. And one way to make those technologies, I agree on some of the market incentives around tax. One way is to, whether it's an import fee or it's a feed-in tariff or tax in the US or tax relief. One way to make the implementation of those technologies swifter and to unify U.S. producers and European producers is just like, let's quit charging each other, ridiculous fees for things like pipes, pumps, pumping. We spend a lot of energy pumping water. An energy efficient pump, the Dutch pumps are great. They lower energy costs, right? A lot of energy efficiency technologies out there that matter. Emissions control technologies, including secure sort of transmission technologies, smart grids, local microgrids, and carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration technologies. If we have to use more brown forms of energy, let's accelerate the transition to a carbon neutral economy by getting more sort of demonstration projects in place. Let's lower the cost of energy efficiency technologies, because as Andreas had mentioned, there's a big sort of demand side thing here, and the many energy people will often make the quip that the first fuel is actually energy efficiency. And so the more that we can make those technologies affordable, it's going to take a lot. It's not a panacea, but it is one sort of arrow in the quiver. And we need everything right now if we're going to hold together this coalition over the long term, because there's real pain involved in cutting out Russian energy from the European market. And I don't think as Americans we should ever underestimate the level of sacrifice that the EU is making. So sort of like for the midterm, I think that we can also use this sort of level of cooperation as a springboard to do other really important long-term things, including quantifying and figuring out how we're going to align with the harmonized tariff system entrained carbon in manufactured products. And so, the EU has put out their CBAM policy, carbon border adjustment, in draft form. I feel that the US has a policy out there, but regardless, if we're going to trade, and let alone if we're going to establish either a carbon club or a carbon customs union where we agree that we're not going to charge each other because we have clean economies, and we both have the same problem where we have clean production economies, but very dirty import economies in terms of where we're consuming a lot of products, then it's pretty. There's a lot of space for technical cooperation on how we do accounting on the product level, and how we're going to organize ourselves. Because I don't think the US is going to have a European style CBAM. I don't see a carbon. Again, we're drinking Starbucks. We're not on steroids, so we're not going to have a carbon price anytime soon. But that doesn't preclude us from having a carbon tariff and having a shared understanding on how to do the taxing and accounting. And I think there's a real opportunity there for us to move forward quickly, particularly in the context of the energy crisis. And then moving on, we need to think about who else we want in the club and how to build sort of a new era leadership coalition on clean energy and secure energy in the 21st century. Because Russia is our problem today. It's likely China is going to be our problem tomorrow, and we really need to remember that we have more in common with our allies than we have differences.
Thank you, Maureen. Actually, that's a great bridge also to the first question that was posted earlier in the session, that Senator Manchin's just returned from Canada. And so this one's for you, Andreas. We know hydrogen has been mentioned by all three of you. And I know this is a big buzzword. We do a lot of work in there with clients as well. It's quite overwhelming and mind-boggling how fast things are going here. So we've seen first the German-Australian hydrogen plan coming up, which actually, initially people were saying like, wow, this looks a bit far on the map in the world, but they're actually doing this. I know that there was a German delegation in Canada this week or last, I believe, discussing similar things, and we can see that the Spanish are quite active in Chile, and they are in North Africa. I mean, where can Canada and the United States actually help in the hydrogen industry? Because the hydrogen demand outlook in Europe is so big that it won't just work with domestically produced stuff. Andreas, how realistic are hydrogen imports, either as liquid hydrogen or liquid ammonia or in any other form? What's going on here?
Well, first of all, I think that judging by EU plans, and these are plans, and we don't have a hydrogen economy as of yet, but just judging by EU plans and looking at the pertinent studies, indeed, we're looking at a massive ramp up of green hydrogen across the globe. And I think it's also important just to bear in mind that whenever those European energy ministers go shopping, including the German energy and climate minister, they don't necessarily only talk LNG, they talk hydrogen. I mean, Norway is a country that has been high up on the list, and for a reason. It's close, it has a clean energy system and a lot of capacity going forward to provide some of what Europe needs. And so I guess this is again, this goes a little bit back to what I said before, plugging holes in the short term, but trying to line up partners in long term. That's precisely what's happening at the moment. Where can the US and the EU work together? I think one of the biggest things is to essentially facilitate that ramp up, and there's two elements to this. One, think about common standards. Think about ways in which you can facilitate the global buildup of a market that isn't there yet, and that ticks all the boxes that Vanessa and Maureen have talked about before. Let's do these things together. Let's agree on standards. Let's think about technology. Let's think about ways to bring down technology costs, scale up what we need to scale up, and rather than the Germans, the French, the Austrians, and the US doing it on their own, we should do it together. But the second thing I think that's important is to bear in mind that at the very end, we're still two blocks that are committed essentially to the liberal market principle. And I think that's important because there's other parts of the world that are not, and they also eye a green hydrogen economy going forward. Now, if we set the standards, if we essentially lead the way in building up that market and shape that market, including technology standards, pricing techniques, and all the rest of it, this will be a market that, to be very blunt, plays according to rules that we have set. And that's not the worst thing to do. We're precisely in that situation at the moment. I'm not saying we're starting from scratch, but we're starting from a very low level when it comes to production and international trade. Now, going forward, there could be tremendous opportunity for companies, consuming industry, but the tax man, if you will, if we get that right across the Atlantic. And I think this is where I would start. And yes, you can facilitate all the rest of it, incubators, joint technology, cooperation, all the rest of it. But I think I would start with the regulatory front, just get the frameworks right, try and agree on things that you can agree on, and then let companies play.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry.
No,
I think
go
you
ahead.
can be Thanks. You can be a system maker or you can be a system taker. And it doesn't behoove the US or the EU to be system takers. We have a great opportunity right now to collaborate and at least figure out how to make our respective systems interoperable and lead the way forward, which is one of the reasons why I also think it's really important to be spending having some detailed time to talk about carbon border adjustment and aligning those principles against the existing trade policy frameworks, because that gives us an opportunity to hit the reset button on so many things that pain both of our economies with these third markets that don't embrace these sort of liberal market principles that are important and are fundamental to both of our systems.
Yeah, and I will just jump in, Henning, because the true mark of an industry, seeing that it has market power, is when it starts to look for a trade association. And guess who's knocking on our door? So we now have a green hydrogen silo at our association. We have a number of our multi-tech producers who are looking at it. But to me, that's always a sign that you have a real industry and a real market maker. So I think that's a great sign and a great point that Andreas makes. And that Marie and I both worked at USTR. We love hearing Andreas talk about setting the rules and making the rules and agreeing to the rules before you stand up the industry. I mean, I think that's the critically important point. If the regulatory systems diverge, then people like Maureen and I we spent years of our lives trying to fix those problems. It's just a hard slog once you've got two systems that don't mesh. We can speak about some of the European American systems that don't mesh and how painful that's been for the industries. So yeah, the earlier we can stand up sort of a process. But that brings me to another point, which is, this is where the Biden administration needs to not just walk and chew gum, but play chess. This is hard stuff. And you need to put people thinking about this and sort of assigned as their day job to thinking about this. And I worry sometimes that this administration is in so many different places. It's got so many priorities, and it's not always clear to those of us in the market who's really driving on some of these initiatives. So two good points raised by Andreas and Maureen are, what is our carbon pricing mechanism going to be? And if we think we have a system that is pricing carbon in a regulatory sense, we need to articulate that more clearly to our allies and have a discussion about that. I mean, I realize it's happening in the context of 232 steel discussions with Europe, but that sort of needs to go on to steroids. And I think, here hydrogen is another perfect example. We need to have people sitting down talking about this. This just can't be like the fifth point on a transatlantic dialogue or the fifth point of someone's other portfolio. This needs to get a higher priority with more brains kind of working on it on a daily basis. And that needs to be clear to industry, because I think honestly, looking at it from the outside in, which is where I sit now, it is not always clear to me and my members who we're supposed to be talking to.
I would echo that point 1,000%. I mean, I worked on technical barriers to trade for a stint in USTR, and I worked with the EU, and the number of sort of debates we would have about issues that had been on the docket for 10 or more years, with an ally, just really felt at some point that we needed a better system. I think that to Vanessa's point, these issues are tremendously complex and complicated, and part of the way that we solve it through good policy design is putting smart people in place and giving them space to actually do the technical work to suss out how to actually create good policy, and not necessarily sort of, chase, whatever is in vogue today. And it's going to take a lot. It's going to take an integration of our energy experts in government, our environmental experts in government, our trade policy experts in government, and our industrial experts in government, as well as a variety of external stakeholders. And if you haven't worked in US government before, those are not verticals that tend to work together often. Europeans are very used to having like a energy and environmental sort of unit that also works very closely with their trade ministries, but we're not sort of organized that way. And we have to really think about ways to break down those government silos, because we don't have time on the climate front, and we don't have the strategic time to not reinforce good market practices with our European allies if we expect this coalition to be held together.
Thank you. One little aspect of, I guess, good news and a live example, I think, where you can see US-European development. So just last year, the Dutch government put out its annual commercial scale subsidy. It's called SDE++, and I've got no relation with them at all, so no worries there for compliance. But it's just so that went to a 50-50 joint venture between US and European companies to develop a CCUS project at the Port of Rotterdam. And that was 5 billion euros at the time, and 50% of that went to this consortium. This same grant has just been reissued. It was originally supposed to be 8.6 billion euros. They've upped it to 13 billion euros because of the Russia crisis. And it is out for the same again. It's hydrogen, clean hydrogen, CCUS, whatever. And I'm fairly certain you're going to see a consortium of US and European companies putting together, because it's such a big project that you need the know-how from American companies, from Dutch companies, from probably Japanese companies might get involved here as well. So you're seeing a lot of cooperation there. That's just, it's just one example. There'll be many of those that I'm aware of. I do see one or two questions here, though. One of them I can very briefly answer, oddly, actually, is how far we are from commercial fusion. Now, I actually, just down the road here, last week visited the Culham Fusion Center, and they were saying they're hiring people age 30 now, so that they can, when they retire, see the first commercial option when they're 70. So they're kind of saying that as a joke, but they actually believe it's going to happen. There's a lot of movement going on. I know that in Europe, in the US, in China as well, but we're not quite there yet. I think it is. But I do want to ask, this is a good question here that's coming in there. Sort of, yes, US and EU, those are the two behemoths of tech and trade. If you're a smaller country, and even a mid-sized country that's seeing all this, how do you, I don't know, jump on the bandwagon here? How do you deal with this? Do you just have to take the rules that the US and the EU are going to create, or how do you influence this game? I don't really know who's going to take this question. Maybe
early mover advantage. Jump in. I think this is a great time for allies to demonstrate. And I'll hand it back over to Andreas. I think it's a great time for allies, the world over, to demonstrate, which team they want to play on. And if you had a configuration that included Switzerland and Norway and Canada and Mexico and Chile and, Peru and others, Japan, South Korea, that's looking more and more, the more the merrier, I think, as in terms of sort of, wanting to set a new standard for how we're going to organize ourselves.
Well, I guess the EU has some experience in that, bringing in small actors with bigger ones as well, doesn't it, Andreas? I mean, how is actually cooperation in Europe going in this green transition? Is it every 27 member states for themselves, or are they really working together?
Well, that's where this very specific animal of the EU comes in, because the treaty says every member state is responsible for their own energy mix, and they can do whatever. At the same time, you got all these things that Maureen described. These horizontal layers on the EU level. Talking about energy efficiency and climate policy and all the rest of it. So in the end, those European level things poke a whole bunch of holes into national energy policy. So there is, I guess, at the very end, since the European Union ever embarked on their 3 energy packages and liberalizing and integrating the energy market, there is no longer the one EU member state energy policy, which means you have you have companies working across the union. That's the beauty of integrating not only a $16 billion economy, but also of integrating a massive energy market. And I think just back one step, this is absolutely crucial. I mean, we should not forget this hasn't been like that 15 years ago. The European Union is not the US. The US is one country. It is, yes, different states, and they all have their own identities. But at the very end, this is one federal country. Whereas in the European Union, you had a whole bunch of countries, 28, now 27, with all of them running their own energy policies, having to some extent their own standards, being in different contractual structures with the external world, and with literally no interconnection between any of them when it comes to electricity or gas or anything else. And that has absolutely changed the last 15 to 20 years. And it also meant that companies from across the European Union are now actively playing in everyone else's playground. And so there's scale effects which across the board are visible with some champions emerging in specific fields. The Danes very prominently in, say, offshore wind, or and the Italian utilities in other places. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is I think we have come quite some way also when it comes to reaping the benefits of an integrated market where you no longer distinguish between small and big, but you play essentially in that common space. But maybe just one thing that I think is important here, and I'm not sure that was at the core of the question, but I guess one of the things that I'd like to stress here is that we do already see, if we go beyond the EU and the OECD world and the US, we already do see some uneven transition patterns. And so we have some countries going first and going quicker and having first mover advantage. And some countries actually get that point that you want to be among the first movers. But you also do have countries that would like to, but can't. And this is a problem. I mean, if you just unpack renewable energy investment across the globe, around 50% of that goes into the non-OECD world, which is great. That has been different in the past. So it's the majority of capital flows now going into the non-OECD world, emerging economies and developing economies. But if you unpack that, essentially it's a handful of countries. It's China, it's a little bit India, it's a little bit of Brazil, and maybe one or two other countries in Southeast Asia. That's where most of the clean investment goes, which also means a couple of billion people around this globe don't get any of that. And the reason why I'm making that point is because FDI, so foreign direct investments, capital, typically comes not only with money, but also with technology. That's what travels on the back of FDI. And if you don't get the FDI in, you don't get the technology in to make the transition happen, which means we'll run the real risk of having essentially a divide between the rich, happy, and green world and not so rich, maybe happy, but certainly very brown world. And in terms of energy system, and that's going to be a headache, because the moment we bring CBAM in, and the moment we link trade and climate policies, we're running the risk of cutting off dozens and dozens of countries out of the global economy. And that's something I'm very concerned with. And I guess the one thing that will facilitate things, and I don't want to get into IPR issues and patents and property rights and all the rest of it. I think the one thing that is really absolutely crucial is to try and can facilitate technology transfer. And there's so many ways you can do this. The easiest way to do it is to de-risk, local energy, renewable energy investment, because that's how you bring technology into countries that are a little bit more difficult when it comes to the investment climate. And again, I'm not entirely sure that was at the core of the question, but I think this is really something that we need to be aware of, despite the fact that we're talking about very serious issues here at the moment, the Ukraine war and what it means for the energy system going forward. We run the real risk of having a global divide in the end. And that's something we need to avoid beyond the immediate impact of the current crisis.
Can I just jump in here, Henning? Because I'm going to just put a little different spin on that. I mean, that's a great concept until you have a country like Mexico, where basically the government has decided that they don't want to pursue clean energy policy, and they're making it very difficult for American companies that are trying to build wind and solar storage projects there to continue to invest. It's become a very unfavorable climate, and that is driven by national politics, right? So I think that's a piece of what Marian's talking about. I mean, it takes vision, it takes leadership to join sort of a movement towards creating an environment where you can welcome investment in those technologies if you don't have it, and most of the world does not, but our companies are willing to go to those places. It's just not helpful when they go to those places and then the government turns against them and makes it almost impossible for them to stay, which is exactly what's happening in Mexico. And I applaud the US government's efforts there. I think they need to do more. I think Canada is united with us in being very concerned about Mexico and the trend they're taking in climate, but that's an example of a country that really has the wherewithal to do more. It's just made political decisions not to do more.
Yeah, and I would piggyback on that. I think it's all about creating incentives. And, one of my big critiques of the drafted EU CBAM is that it doesn't provide a meaningful pathway for developing countries to participate in the market economy and in the clean economy. At the end of the day, developing countries need foreign exchange, and they are producing things at a level that is appropriate for their level of development. And we have to be respectful of that. In particular, because of our history and in the world, in colonialism and all the other sort of like institutional creations that have maintained a global economic system that has kept some countries in a more sort of mercantilist posture. And so, what should we do? I think strongly that there is a path forward for development-based preferences programs where, our border adjustments are either drawn back or paid back or foregone to developing countries in the short term. If they sort of commit to a plan, you see government investments being made in environmental infrastructure. We can forgo tariffs on that those environmental products from the EU and the US. And then in the short term, any sort of border adjustments should be forgiven, because if you're a developing country and you produce, X commodity, you still need to produce X commodity. This also helps us on the back end, because the thing that a lot of environmentalists don't want to confront is that many of these clean technologies take minerals and materials that come from mined sources that we don't actually have in the US in abundant supply, or in the EU in abundant supply. And so we need to think about, how to create those comprehensive value chains. We need to think about reasonable ways to help developing countries walk the right path and stay on the right path, and have a realistic short-term ability to still build their industry and develop.
A great point there, Maureen. You also almost answered one of the questions here, how critical raw materials that are needed for this green and digital transition can be accessed. And as you mentioned, these are mostly at home in the ground in emerging markets, many in the Southern Hemisphere, and there will be a lot of investment required to access these resources in a sustainable way, in order to ensure that these sustainable technologies actually use raw materials that are also sustainably mined and sourced. So I think there's going to be a lot of issues there. There's one direct question for you. If you could try and answer that in 1 minute, because then we have to hand back. But which are the sort of, between the US and EU, the products where tariffs could be raised really easily? Are there is there low-hanging fruit there that could be addressed quite fast, or is it all complicated and difficult?
This is a spectacular question, and I have a great answer. I spent many years of my life working on the Environmental Goods Agreement. I can say unequivocally, I won't mention names, but I can say unequivocally, there was almost no daylight between the EU and the US's position. We have very similar definitions of what constitutes an environmental product. We have similar understanding of how those products can contribute to environmental outcomes. And I think with the technological innovation that's occurred since then, we have a lot of opportunity to advance new areas of technical cooperation. I don't think, that's why I said on the top, I don't think this would be a very heavy lift for these two markets in particular, just because there is so much shared knowledge and belief and understanding. And if we're working on a preferential basis, it makes it even easier.
Great. Ken, I think we have to hand back to you.
I apologize. My virtual background got all messed up here. Apologies on that front. I got actually logged off in the middle of our session. So sorry about that, everyone. But thank you very much, Andreas, Maureen, Vanessa, and Henning. WITA will continue to address the nexus of Russian sanctions and trade environmental issues in part with the support of Silverado Policy Accelerator. Another issue that came up today in connection with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and related sanctions is the issue of critical minerals, which we hope to address in the weeks to come as well. Reminder, if you are able, we hope you join us in supporting the work of World Central Kitchen. You can find information on that event in the program we sent around and in the chat and on our website. Thank you very much, Maureen, Henning, Vanessa, and Andreas. Really insightful conversation and very grateful to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.